Imagine walking through the dense jungles of southern Mexico, the air thick with humidity, the ground soft beneath your feet, when suddenly, through the overgrowth, you encounter a colossal stone head. It stares at you with heavy-lidded eyes and an expression that is neither welcoming nor hostile, but something in between, calm, commanding, and utterly alien to the modern world. These stone faces, some standing over 10 feet tall and weighing as much as 50 tons, were carved more than 3,000 years ago by a people we now call the Olmecs. To many, they are the first great civilization of the Americas, the hidden root from which so much of Mesoamerican culture later grew. And yet, their story is not widely told. Who were these people who shaped mountains of stone into portraits of their rulers? Why did they rise, dominate the landscape for centuries, and then vanish into the shadows of history? Tonight, we step into that forgotten world. The Olmecs left no written history that survives in any complete form, but they left traces villages built on high ground to escape the floods, ceremonial centers aligned with the stars, and diets sustained by maize, beans, and squash, as well as turtles, deer, and even the humble dog. They carved jade masks, so lifelike they seem to breathe when you hold them to the light, and axes of green stone that were never meant to cut, but instead to carry symbolic weight in rituals. They built cities such as San Lorenzo and Venta, experiments that stood not as sprawling metropolises, but as ceremonial hearts, where priests and rulers orchestrated rituals that bound their people together. To stand in their presence today, whether before a colossal head or a delicate jade figurine, is to feel both awe and unease, because behind their artistry lies a deeper mystery. Were the Olmecs truly the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization from which the Maya, Zapotecs, and Aztecs drew their earliest inspiration? Or were they one culture among many, simply part of a larger, more complex web of societies developing side by side? The jungle keeps its secrets well, but the stones whisper if you listen closely. In this journey, we will walk through the forgotten villages, trace the origins of their art, examine the clues hidden in their DNA, and confront the myths that surround them. Each step will take us closer to the heart of a civilization that seems to both invite and resist our understanding. And the question remains, lingering in the humid air: were the Olmecs the beginning of the story, or just one chapter of a much larger tale? Beneath the towering ceremonial centers of San Lorenzo and Venta lay another world, quieter but no less important, the villages where the Olmecs lived their daily lives. These were not cities of stone pyramids and bustling markets, but clusters of homes scattered across higher ground, raised deliberately above the swampy floodplains. Imagine them, houses of wood and thatch, simple yet functional, with lean-tos for shade and storage pits dug into the earth like secret chambers, holding food and supplies. Around each dwelling, small gardens flourished, not just for survival, but for medicine and flavor. There was the sharp fragrance of herbs, the bright yellow of sunflowers, and the dark green leaves of plants destined to heal or to season a meal. Fruit trees stood nearby, their branches heavy with avocados or the precious cacao pods that would one day become sacred to later civilizations. Life here revolved around the land, and the land demanded both patience and ingenuity. The Olmecs mastered two methods of farming. They planted along riverbanks during the dry seasons, taking advantage of fertile soil left by floods. But when those fields grew tired, they turned to slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing forests and leaving behind rich ash to nourish the soil. Out in those shifting fields grew the staples of their world: maize, beans, squash, cassava, and sweet potato. Maize in particular grew in importance as time passed, transforming from just another crop into the sacred backbone of an entire culture. Yet the Olmec diet was never narrow. The rivers provided fish, turtles, snakes, and mollusks, while the coasts yielded crabs and shellfish. The forests added birds and game, peccaries rooting in the underbrush, rabbits darting through fields, and deer whose meat must have been both prized and celebrated. But the most surprising find comes not from the hunt or the harvest, but from the middens, the trash heaps left behind. Their archaeologists discovered that the single most plentiful source of meat was not deer, not turtle, but dog. The Olmecs domesticated and ate them. A fact that unsettles modern minds, yet reminds us how deeply their survival was tied to every available resource. In these villages, we see a rhythm of life: fields tilled, fires burning, meals shared, rituals whispered. The grand centers may have drawn the eye of history, but it was here, among the villagers, that the Olmec people truly lived. And yet, as we move from the fields into the ceremonial plazas, we begin to see that their lives were bound not just to the cycles of the land, but to forces larger and more mysterious forces that demanded monuments in stone and rituals carved into the very fabric of their society. If the villages were the heartbeat of daily survival, then San Lorenzo was the first great experiment in power and ceremony. Rising around 1400 BC, it became the earliest known Olmec center, perched upon a natural ridge that overlooked the surrounding floodplains. From a distance, it may have seemed unassuming, but closer inspection reveals a landscape carefully shaped by human ambition. The Olmecs did not simply settle upon the land, they sculpted it. They cut terraces into the earth, redirected streams to serve both ritual and practical needs, and created vast platforms upon which rulers could stand above their people. Imagine the view: green plains stretching endlessly, the shimmer of water in the distance, and the stone silhouettes of colossal heads watching silently over it all. These heads carved from basalt, brought from quarries miles away, were not random works of art. Each was a portrait, scholars believe, of rulers who held sway during San Lorenzo's height. Their lips are full, their eyes deep, their helmets carved with intricate patterns, and their presence overwhelming. To move one of these heads, weighing up to 50 tons, required coordination, labor, and authority. The act itself was a statement of power. Only those who could command both the people and the land could summon such monuments into being. But San Lorenzo was more than stone heads. Archaeological evidence shows complex drainage systems carved from basalt, channels that may have carried water but also symbolized control over life-giving forces. Thrones' massive stone blocks shaped into seats or altars suggested a stage where rulers enacted rituals that bound community to cosmos. Around these ceremonial cores, life unfolded in layers, the elite in the center, surrounded by artisans and commoners who supported the ceremonial machine with food, labor, and loyalty. Yet even at its peak, San Lorenzo was vulnerable. By 900 BC, its power waned. Some believe natural forces played a role: rivers shifting course, soil losing fertility, or perhaps volcanic activity reshaping the land. Others point to human hands, suggesting uprisings or rival factions challenging the center's dominance. Whatever the cause, San Lorenzo declined, leaving behind colossal heads buried in earthen fragments of a society that had sought to mold the land into its image. From this fall, however, another center rose. Grander and more ambitious Venta, And in Venta, we begin to see not just the shaping of land, but the shaping of belief, myth, and mystery that would echo across Mesoamerica for centuries to come. After the decline of San Lorenzo, power and vision shifted eastward, and by 900 BC a new ceremonial heart had emerged, Venta. If San Lorenzo had been an experiment in reshaping the land, Venta was a masterpiece of symbolism and scale. Rising from a swampy plain, the city was laid out with deliberate geometry, its core dominated by a massive earthen pyramid nearly 100 feet high, one of the earliest in Mesoamerica. To the modern eye it appears as a simple mound, weathered by time, but imagine it in its prime. Smooth, steep sides glistening in the sun, painted perhaps in colors that have long since vanished. A man-made mountain meant to connect earth to sky. Around it stretched plazas, platforms, and ceremonial courts aligned with the cosmos, suggesting that the very act of walking through Venta was a movement through myth and order. It was here that the Olmecs elevated their artistry to new heights. Jade mosaics were buried beneath the ground, intricate patterns of green stone laid out in secret as offerings to unseen powers. Colossal heads stood once again as guardians, but so did colossal thrones, carved with figures emerging from cave-like openings. Imagery scholars interpret as rulers communing with ancestral or divine realms. Everywhere one looks, the symbols point beyond the visible world to jaguars, serpents, and figures caught in transformation, half human, half beast. These were not mere decorations. They were the visual language of Olmec belief, signs that power came not only from earthly control, but from connection to forces larger than any man. Life in Venta would have been a constant negotiation between the ordinary and the sacred. Farmers and fishers supported the population. Traders carried jade and obsidian across vast distances, and artisans shaped clay and stone into ritual objects meant to last beyond lifetimes. Yet, for all its grandeur, Venta too carried within it the seeds of fragility. By 400 BC, the city that had stood as a symbol of Olmec power and belief fell silent. Some think environmental change once again played its part. Others suspect political upheaval or shifting trade networks drew people elsewhere. Whatever the cause, Venta's ceremonial core was abandoned, its monuments toppled or buried deliberately, as though the Olmecs themselves chose to erase their presence. But though the city fell, its imagery, its symbols, and its mystery lived on, carried into the hearts of cultures yet to rise, who would reinterpret and remake them in their own way. And so the question grows louder: were the Olmecs the beginning of it all, or only a shadow cast by something even older? Of all the relics the Olmecs left behind, none capture the imagination more than the colossal heads, each one carved from a single massive basalt boulder, transported over miles of treacherous rivers and swamps, some weighing as much as 40 tons. Imagine the sound of stone grinding against stone, the sweat of hundreds of laborers dragging ropes across wooden rollers, the slow, grueling progress of weeks, perhaps months, just to bring a single block into place. And then the artistry, chisels of stone and sand, precise and patient, transforming raw rock into faces. Not generic masks, but unique visages, with full lips, wide noses, and expressions that range from stern command to quiet contemplation. Scholars believe these are portraits of rulers, each immortalized in stone, their identities known only to the people who once bowed before them. To stand before one today is to feel dwarfed not only by its size, but by the presence it radiates us. If the stone itself remembers authority, what is striking is the detail. Elaborate helmets or headdresses, perhaps used in war or ceremonial ball games. Faint lines and markings that may have carried symbolic meaning. These heads suggest a society that revered its leaders, not only as political figures, but as intermediaries between human and divine realms. Yet there is a deeper mystery. How did the Olmecs move such immense stones without the wheel, without beasts of burden, through jungles and floodplains? Some suggest ingenious rafts and waterways. Others believe the sheer force of human labor was organized on a scale almost unimaginable. Each head, once placed, seems to have been part of a sacred arrangement, standing as guardians in plazas or ceremonial centers, watching over rituals that bound the community together. And when San Lorenzo and Venta were abandoned, the heads were not left casually. They were buried, toppled, or deliberately defaced, as though to strip them of power or hide them from the eyes of strangers. Were these acts of reverence or of rebellion? Did new rulers seek to erase the memory of the old, or was this a ritual of closure, returning the stone faces to the earth from which they came? Whatever the truth, the colossal heads remain silent, witnesses to a forgotten age. Their sheer existence speaks of ambition, devotion, and a culture that measured greatness, not in words, but in enduring stone. And yet, as we gaze into their weathered features, we are left to wonder, who were the men behind these faces, and why did their names vanish into silence? If the colossal heads tell us about rulers, then the smaller carvings, the figurines, and the strange hybrid creatures carved into jade and basalt whisper of something else, the realm of the gods. The Olmecs left behind no written texts to explain their beliefs, yet the imagery is powerful enough to suggest a spiritual system both rich and unsettling. At the center of this symbolic world was the jaguar, muscular, fierce, and silent. The jaguar prowled the jungles at night, its roar echoing like thunder. To the Olmecs, it was more than an animal. It was a bridge to the unseen. We find figures of wood jaguars, beings with human bodies but feline features, downturned mouths, slanted eyes, cleft heads. Were these depictions of shamans in trance, rulers transformed through ritual, or mythic beings that existed between human and divine? Some scholars call them gods, others spirits. Still others see them as metaphors for the untamed forces of nature. Alongside the jaguar are serpents, birds of prey, crocodiles, creatures of water, sky, and earth. Together, they suggest a pantheon tied deeply to the elements, a worldview in which the cosmos was alive with power that could be invoked, controlled, or feared. And then there are the infants. Carved from jade, they appear as small, limp babies with feline traits, held by adult figures as offerings. Some interpret this as a myth of divine children, others as evidence of rituals involving sacrifice, perhaps even of the young. It is a haunting image, one that refuses easy explanation, and it gives us a glimpse into a belief system where creation and destruction, fertility and death were tightly intertwined. Archaeologists have found elaborate caches buried beneath plazas, jade celts arranged like rays of the sun, figurines placed in careful patterns, all covered by layers of earth, never meant to be seen again. These offerings speak of a culture where ritual was not performance, but contract, a binding agreement between people and gods. And while we can only guess at the chants, the dancers, the smoke rising from burning copal resin, we know that belief guided every aspect of Olmec life. It was their invisible architecture, shaping cities and rulers alike. But what happened when belief shifted? Did the gods they carved remain constant, or did they too fade into silence as new civilizations rose? The Olmec pantheon, like their faces, is frozen in stone, but the faith behind it lingers as a shadow we cannot fully grasp. Beyond the grand monuments, beyond the towering heads and ritual caches, the majority of Olmecs lived in small, scattered villages, tucked into the higher ground of the riversides and forests of Veracruz and Tabasco. Imagine a cluster of simple homes, each constructed with thatched roofs and walls of wattle and daub, their floors packed earth, sometimes smoothed with clay. Outside each dwelling, a lean-to for tools. One or more storage pits dug deep into the soil root cellars where maize, beans, or squash could be kept safe from rot and rodents. The villages themselves were modest, connected by narrow dirt paths winding through the trees, with gardens at the edges where medicinal herbs, sunflowers, or perhaps cacao and avocado grew in deliberate chaos. Flooding rivers enriched the soil, yet the Olmecs were not solely dependent on these fertile banks. Slash-hand-burn techniques cleared patches of forest, providing new fields when old ones became exhausted, leaving the land in constant negotiation between cultivation and wilderness. Crops like maize became increasingly central to the Olmec diet, but diversity remained. Beans, squash, sweet potatoes, cassava each cultivated with care, each providing sustenance for a community that also hunted and fished. Rivers and coasts offered turtle, fish, and mollusks, while forests supplied deer, peccary, raccoon, rabbit, and birds of all kinds. Remarkably, in San Lorenzo, archaeologists found that domesticated dogs were the most common source of animal protein, a testament to how human and animal lives were intertwined in daily survival. Food preparation would have been both laborious and intimate, grinding maize on stone matatas, roasting fish over smoky fires, tending gardens with the rhythm of the sun and seasons. Life was cyclical, structured around planting, harvesting, hunting, and ritual. Yet even amidst these routines, traces of Olmec grandeur crept into daily life. Small ceremonial spaces, modest temples, or shrines could be found near larger villages, their presence a reminder that the sacred was never far from the mundane. These settlements may appear simple to us, but in their design and distribution, they reveal a society that balanced practical survival with spiritual consciousness, one capable of creating monumental art while tending to the smallest details of daily life. And yet, even in this ordinary existence, one question lingers. How did the rhythms of everyday life shape the culture that produced the colossal heads, the intricate jade, and the haunting, half-human gods that still stare at us from across millennia? Step quietly now, and imagine walking among the Olmecs, not in the villages of simple homes, but in the shadows of their ceremonial centers, where stone monuments rise like echoes of a world both tangible and otherworldly. San Lorenzo and Venta were not cities in the sense we might understand. They were sacred stages, designed with deliberate geometry, where earth and stone, river and forest, converged in a ritual landscape. At the heart of these centers, colossal heads towering over 3 meters stood as silent witnesses to ceremonies long lost to time. These heads, each unique, each carved with painstaking precision, likely depicted rulers, shamans or deities, though the exact meaning remains elusive. Surrounding them, plazas and mounds created a rhythm of space, guiding the movement of participants through processions and observances whose purpose we can only speculate. Within these spaces, jade axes and figurines were not merely ornamental but held profound spiritual significance. The kunzax, polished and heavy, was shaped like a weapon but intended for ritual, a tool to connect the living with forces beyond human comprehension. Offerings were placed in caches, sometimes beneath mounds or in watery pits, their placement deliberate, a silent dialogue with the unseen. The Olmec spiritual life extended to the natural world, where rivers, forests, and mountains were imbued with power, and animals carried symbolic weight. Jaguars, serpents, and birds appear repeatedly in their iconography, creatures that could traverse worlds, embodying strength, cunning, and transformation. Shamans may have worn masks, embodying these creatures, entering altered states of consciousness to commune with ancestors or gods. Yet even in their devotion, ambiguity reigned. We cannot know the exact words, chants, or gestures, only the traces left in stone, clay, and bone. Some researchers suggest that their rituals involved complex cycles of death and renewal, reflecting both agricultural life and cosmic order. Others propose that the Olmecs were exploring the boundaries between human and supernatural, a theme evident in the Jaguar figures and hybrid deities that populate their art. These ceremonies, though distant from our modern understanding, reveal a civilization profoundly engaged with mysteries larger than themselves. And as we linger in the quiet spaces where ceremonies once unfolded, we are left with a haunting question. What did it feel like to live in a world where the divine and the human were so intimately intertwined, and where every carved head and ritual object was a doorway into the unknown? Now, step away from the monumental stone heads and the ceremonial centers, and move into the villages where the majority of the Olmecs lived, where life was quieter, yet no less intricate. Unlike the grand plazas of San Lorenzo or Venta, these villages were scattered across higher ground, often overlooking rivers that provided both sustenance and occasional peril. Houses were modest, made of perishable materials, simple structures with thatched roofs and walls of wood or reeds. Yet each home contained the elements necessary for survival. Small lean-tos provided extra shelter and storage pits cool. Subterranean spaces kept harvested crops and foodstuffs safe from heat, moisture, and scavengers. Around these dwellings, gardens flourished, cultivating herbs for medicine and cooking, as well as sunflowers, squash, and other smaller crops. Their seeds and blossoms a reminder of human ingenuity in a wild landscape. Fruit trees like avocado and cacao may have dotted the surroundings, providing both nourishment and a connection to the land's natural rhythm. Beyond the village boundaries, fields stretched outward, cleared by a combination of riverbank planting and slash-and-burn techniques. Maize, beans, squash, cassava, and sweet potatoes formed the backbone of the Olmec diet, gradually growing in importance over centuries, while wild resources supplemented the staple crops. Rivers teemed with fish, turtles, and mollusks, while forests offered game like deer, peccary, rabbits, and opossums. Even snakes and birds could find their way into a meal, a testament to adaptability in an unpredictable environment. Yet, somewhat surprisingly, archaeological surveys indicate that domesticated dogs were the most consistent source of animal protein, living companions whose role extended beyond companionship into the very survival of their humans. Life in these villages was a delicate balance between labor and leisure, cultivation and hunting, survival and ceremony. Each day, Olmecs negotiated the demands of nature, tending crops, maintaining homes, and sustaining a social fabric that tied each person to family, community, and ritual. These rhythms, though lost to us in detail, hint at a civilization rooted in both practicality and reverence. From the fertile gardens to the wild forests, the Olmecs carved a life from the land, creating a foundation that would sustain them for centuries. And yet, even here, amid the ordinary, there remains a sense of mystery. How did these villagers perceive their world, their gods, and the colossal figures that stood not far from their homes, silently watching over the rhythm of everyday life? As we move from the daily rhythms of village life, we enter a world that is far less tangible world of ritual, of spiritual practice, and of beliefs that shaped the very soul of Olmec society. The Olmecs left no written records in the form of books or scrolls. Yet the stone and jade artifacts, the colossal heads, and the intricately carved steely whisper of a people deeply entwined with the divine. Temples, modest in the villages, yet grand in ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, served as spaces where humans and gods intersected. Some researchers suggest that the Olmecs worshipped the pantheon of deities, with the jaguar often at the center, a creature that embodied power, transformation, and the mysteries of the natural and supernatural world. Other symbols appear repeatedly in their artwork: serpents, feathered beings, and figures that seem to blur the line between human and animal, hinting at beliefs in shapeshifting or spiritual duality. Rituals likely combine the mundane and the sacred. Offerings of jade, obsidian, and carved stone objects have been found buried within ceremonial spaces, sometimes alongside human remains. These acts, it seems, were more than decorative. They were a dialogue with unseen forces, a means of negotiating the unpredictable cycles of life, flood, harvest, and fertility. Some scholars propose that the Olmecs may have practiced bloodletting or other forms of bodily offering, a physical connection to their gods meant to ensure the continuation of life and the favor of the supernatural. The presence of large ceremonial objects, like the coon's axe, demonstrates that ritual was not only personal but also publica, performance of power and piety that reinforced social hierarchies and community identity. Even the monumental heads may have served a spiritual purpose, immortalizing leaders whose presence bridged the mortal and divine, suggesting a culture where authority and religion were inseparable. And yet, much remains uncertain. We can hypothesize, we can analyze motifs, and compare them to later Mesoamerican practices. But the precise meanings of these symbols, the details of their ceremonies, the prayers whispered into the wind, these remain elusive. From one carved figure to the next, from the soft rustle of maize in the wind to the echo of distant drums. The Olmec world of ritual and belief is one of intrigue and enigma, where every artifact hints at secrets lost to time. As we leave behind the temples and move toward the artistic legacy of the Olmec, the question lingers: what truths did they encode in stone? And how did the spiritual life of these people shape the civilizations that would follow? Next, we move from the sacred spaces of ritual into the very heart of Olmec expression, their artistry. Imagine standing before a colossal stone head, its surface worn yet unyielding, eyes staring with a weight that transcends millennia. These monumental sculptures, carved from basalt, transported across miles of river and jungle, reflect more than technical skill. They speak of identity, authority, and a culture obsessed with preserving its vision in stone. Each head, some towering over 3 meters tall and weighing several tons, is unique, with facial features that suggest not a single idealized ruler, but perhaps multiple leaders or even symbolic archetypes of power. Researchers debate whether these faces were portraits, ancestral effigies, or divine intermediaries. And in truth, the mystery endures. Beyond the colossal heads, smaller artifacts, jade masks, figurines, and celts reveal a mastery of material and a symbolic language that is both intricate and enigmatic. Jade, in particular, held an almost sacred significance. Smooth, luminous, and durable, it was fashioned into axes, masks, and jewelry that likely served both ritual and elite display purposes. Some of these objects were too finely crafted for practical use, suggesting they were ceremonial, meant to bridge the material world and the spiritual one. Animal motifs abound in Olmec art, with jaguars, serpents, and hybrid creatures appearing again and again, their forms merging human and beasts in ways that challenge our understanding of Olmec cosmology. The recurring jaguar figure, with its feline features and infant-like qualities, hints at myths of creation, transformation, or divine ancestry. Yet, we can only speculate about the narratives these images conveyed. Even everyday objects, like vessels and incised stones, carry this symbolic weight, suggesting that art in Olmec society was never purely decorative. It was a medium of communication, a record of belief, and a tool for social cohesion. Art and power were intertwined. Those who could commission or create these objects wielded influence over both the earthly and spiritual realms. And yet, for all its sophistication, much of Olmec art remains undeciphered, its meanings obscured by time and cultural distance. Each piece is a riddle, a message in a bottle sent across 3,000 years, waiting for the curious and the patient to uncover its story. As we leave the carved stones and jade behind, we must ask, how did this artistry influence the generations of civilizations that would rise in Mesoamerica? And what secrets did the Olmecs embed in the shapes and symbols that still haunt us today? From the grandeur of stone and jade, we turn our gaze to the quieter, often overlooked world of the Olmec villages, where daily life pulsed beneath the shadow of ceremonial centers. Picture a settlement perched on slightly higher ground, clusters of modest houses scattered amid patches of cultivated land, their thatched roofs rustling softly in the warm Gulf winds. These were not the monumental centers like San Lorenzo or Venta, but rather homes of the people who built, fed, and sustained the culture. Each dwelling was practical, consisting of a main house, a lean-to for work or storage, and one or more subterranean pits, dark and cool, storing roots, maize, and other provisions. Gardens abutted these homes, tended carefully for medicinal herbs, smaller crops, and the domesticated sunflower, while the wild grew nearby, avocado, cacao, and other fruits that dotted the landscape, waiting to be gathered. The Olmecs practiced both riverbank agriculture and slash-and-burn techniques, clearing dense forest patches to make room for fields that produced maize, beans, squash, cassava, and sweet potatoes. Archaeologists studying villages in the Tuxelos Mountains have noted that maize gradually became central to the Olmec diet. Yet the community maintained a diverse menu. Rivers provided fish, turtles, and mollusks. Coastal areas offered crabs and shellfish. Forests and scrublands yielded game such as peccary, opossum, raccoon, rabbit, and especially deer. Birds of various kinds were also hunted for sustenance. Surprisingly, midden studies in San Lorenzo suggest that domesticated dogs were the most common source of animal protein, a quiet testament to human-animal relationships in the heart of Mesoamerica. Life in these villages was rhythmic and cyclical, defined by planting, harvesting, hunting, and preparing for ceremonies that linked them to the larger ceremonial centers. It was in these modest homes that children grew, artisans learnt their craft, and knowledge of the land and its cycles passed from generation to generation, while the colossal heads and jade masks capture our imagination. The day-to-day survival and ingenuity of these village communities remind us that civilizations are not solely built on monuments, they are built on human labor, observation, and resilience. And as we leave the village behind, we are left with a lingering question. How did these humble lives intertwine with the myths, rituals, and monumental ambitions of a culture that would echo across centuries? Beyond the simple dwellings and cultivated fields, the Olmecs left a legacy etched in stone, a language of ritual and power that continues to intrigue archaeologists and historians alike. Imagine standing before a massive jade coon's axe, its polished surface catching the light, its edge sharp in form though never used as a tool, its size and precision suggesting reverence rather than utility. Carved from jadeite, one of the hardest stones in Mesoamerica, these ritual objects required extraordinary skill, patience, and understanding of the material. Scholars like George Kunz, in the late 19th century, marveled at the craftsmanship, documenting objects that were far more than mere tools. They were conduits between the human and the divine, symbols of authority and spiritual insight. These ceremonial artifacts, ranging from intricately carved celts to jade masks, speak of a society where ritual permeated daily life. Every curve, every incision seems purposeful, as though each object held a story, a coded message about leadership, the cosmos, or the unseen forces that governed the Olmec world. From the colossal heads, which loom over landscapes with eyes that seem to follow the observer, to smaller figurines like the twins from El Azuzel, the artistry evokes a powerful blend of mystery and mastery. Some researchers believe these objects were used in rites connected to fertility, rain, or ancestor worship, while others suggest they might have served as markers of status or territorial claims. Even the choice of materials, jade, serpentine, basalt, carries meaning. These were not mere stones, but embodiments of wealth, power, and sacred energy. The placement of these objects within ceremonial centers, sometimes buried or arranged in precise patterns, hints at cosmological significance, a worldview where earth, water, sky, and human life were inextricably intertwined. Yet much about their purpose remains elusive, leaving us to wonder about the rituals performed in their presence. Did they witness chants, offerings, or blood sacrifices? Were they tokens of protection or keys to understanding the universe as the Olmecs perceived it? As we run our minds over the contours of these stones, feeling the weight of time pressing down, we begin to glimpse the profound depth of a civilization that communicated not through written words, but through art, geometry, and ritual. And so, we move from the tangible solidity of jade and basalt to the subtle traces of memory and history left in the land itself, wondering what secrets the Olmec landscape still holds, waiting to be unearthed. For centuries, the Olmecs remained invisible to history, their colossal monuments buried in forests and their culture forgotten by the people who later inhabited the land. It was not until the mid-19th century that the first true rediscovery occurred. Imagine a farmer in Veracruz in the late 1850s, clearing his fields with little more than machete and sweat, when the edge of a massive stone surface emerges from the earth. Slowly, with effort, a head of stone larger than a man comes into view. This was Boat's monument, the first colossal Olmec head uncovered. Word spread, and in 1862, José Melgar y Serrano, a Mexican antiquarian traveler, visited the site, documenting the strange sculpture with a mix of awe and confusion. His description, published years later, was the earliest written report of what we now recognize as Olmec culture. At the time, however, the artifact puzzled scholars. It did not fit neatly into the frameworks of known Mesoamerican civilizations, and so for decades its origins were debated, dismissed, or misunderstood. By the late 19th century, more artifacts began surfacing the Kunzaks, among them drawing attention to a unique, artistic style that did not quite belong to the Maya, the Zapotic, or the Aztec. Yet even then, most assumed these works were outliers, curiosities, or perhaps misattributed to the wrong civilizations. It wasn't until the 1920s that Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge, traveling deep into Tabasco and Veracruz, gave more detailed descriptions of sites like La Venta and San Martin, Pajapan. Even then, they were inclined to ascribe them to the Maya, uncertain of the culture that had produced such wonders. It took Matthew Stirling of the Smithsonian Institution in the 1930s and 1940s to begin the first truly scientific excavations of Olmec sites. Alongside art historian Miguel Covarrubias, Stirling advanced a bold theory that the Olmecs predated the Maya, that they were not a side note but perhaps the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization itself. This theory ignited fierce debate, challenging long-held beliefs and sparking rivalries among archaeologists. In 1942, at a conference in Tuxtla Gutiérrez, Alfonso Caso went further still, declaring the Olmecs to be the mother culture of Mesoamerica. The claim was provocative, radical, and it forced scholars to reconsider the deep roots of civilizations across the region. And yet, even as radiocarbon dating in the years that followed confirmed the antiquity of Olmec artifacts, the debate only deepened, leaving us with a tantalizing question: were the Olmecs truly the progenitors of all that followed? Or were they but one of many brilliant sparks in the vast tapestry of Mesoamerica? As the Olmecs emerged from obscurity into the light of archaeological discovery, one question quickly dominated scholarly debate: were they the true mother culture of Mesoamerica, or simply one of many civilizations that rose and fell in parallel? Alfonso Caso's declaration in 1942 that the Olmecs were the cultura madre was bold and resonated with the evidence that was beginning to surface. Their monumental architecture, their distinct iconography, their advanced agricultural practices seemed to suggest that the Olmecs were not just early, but foundational, laying the blueprint for civilizations like the Maya, Zapotic, and Aztec who came centuries later. Supporters of this theory, such as Matthew Stirling and Miguel Covarrubias, pointed to Olmec motifs, the jaguar, the serpent, the hybrid figures that echoed across later cultures. They saw continuity in art styles, in religious symbolism, even in political structures, and argued that the Olmecs must have spread their influence widely, seeding the traditions that others would refine. Yet not all agreed. Prominent Mayonists like J. Eric Thompson and Sylvanus Morley resisted the idea, proposing instead that the Olmecs were contemporaneous with the Maya, or perhaps even derived from them. To claim the Olmecs as a mother culture was, in their view, to oversimplify a vast, interconnected region full of diverse peoples and parallel innovations. And indeed, archaeological discoveries complicated the story. Sites like Xochipelco revealed ceramic traditions dating back 5,000 years, long before the Olmecs rose to prominence. San Jose Magote, linked to the early Zapotecs, displayed irrigation systems and social organization that predated Olmec centers. These findings hinted that the Olmecs were not alone in their advancements, but part of a wider web of innovation and exchange. Some scholars began to suggest that Mesoamerica was not birthed by a single culture, but by a mosaic of peoples, each contributing to the region's intellectual and spiritual evolution. In this view, the Olmecs were extraordinary, yes, but not singular. They were participants in a chorus rather than the lone voice that began the song of Mesoamerica. Even today, the debate continues. Some argue the Olmecs inspired much of what came after, while others insist they were only one branch in a great tree of civilizations. And so, the question lingers like an unresolved chord. Did the Olmecs give birth to Mesoamerican civilization, or were they simply one among many children of a much older and more complex lineage? Perhaps nothing captures the imagination about the Olmecs more than their colossal stone heads, those silent, looming faces carved from basalt, each weighing up to 40 tons and standing as high as a man on horseback. Discovered first in the 19th century and later excavated in greater numbers, these monumental sculptures seem to radiate both power and enigma. Each head is distinct, as though modeled after an individual person, with fleshy lips, broad noses, and stern expressions that suggest authority and command. Scholars widely believe they represent rulers, immortalized in stone not just as leaders, but as embodiments of divine or supernatural power. To create them required astonishing effort. The basalt itself had to be quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains, sometimes transported more than 60 miles across swamps and rivers without beasts of burden or the wheel. Imagine the labor, hundreds of men hauling a massive block, dragging it on wooden rollers or perhaps along rafts, chanting in rhythm as they inched forward. Once delivered, the stone would be carved using simple stone tools, painstakingly chipping away for months or years until the commanding visage emerged. Yet despite their scale, no two are identical. The head from San Lorenzo wears what looks like a helmet, perhaps a symbol of warfare or a ritual ball game. The one from Venta has softer features, almost contemplative. Others display faint traces of adornments that may have been painted or decorated, though centuries of erosion have hidden these details from us. What's more, the colossal heads were not randomly placed. They were positioned within ceremonial centers, aligned with plazas and altars, standing like guardians at the threshold of sacred spaces. Were they meant to intimidate, to remind subjects of the ruler's eternal gaze, or to serve as conduits through which the spirit of the deceased leader could still influence the living? The mystery deepens when we consider that no tools or inscriptions accompany them. No clear record of who these rulers were, or why their likenesses demanded such permanence. Some suggest they were dynastic founders. Others believe they represent mythic heroes whose stories have been lost to time. And so the colossal heads remain, silent, immovable, gazing out across millennia with an expression both familiar and alien, as if daring us to guess their secret. One cannot help but wonder, were they monuments to power, warnings to enemies, or something far stranger, beyond the colossal heads? Another class of Olmec monuments reveals a different aspect of their world, the so-called altars or thrones. These massive carved stone blocks, often rectangular in shape, appear at the ceremonial centers of San Lorenzo and Venta, each weighing many tons and bearing intricate reliefs. To stand before one is to confront not only the brute force of stone, but the layered symbolism etched into its surface. At first glance, They resemble thrones' broad platforms with niches at the front, as if designed for rulers to sit upon them during rituals. Indeed, some show figures emerging from the niches, crouched or seated, grasping ropes that extend outwards to bind captives or connect to mythic beings. Others show humans cradling Wurjagoa infants, those strange hybrid creatures central to Olmec iconography, as though presenting them to the world or receiving them from another realm. These carvings blur the line between politics and spirituality, reminding us that Olmec rulers were more than administrators. They were mediators between their people and the forces of the cosmos. To sit upon such a throne, one might imagine, was not merely an act of governance, but an assertion of sacred duty, a declaration that the ruler himself embodied divine authority. Yet, like so much of Olmec art, the meaning resists final explanation. Were these thrones truly seats for living kings, or were they altars for ritual sacrifices, where offerings of blood or life were made to secure the favor of the gods? The niches suggest portals, liminal spaces between this world and the next, perhaps entrances to the underworld from which ancestors or deities could emerge. The ropes carved into the stone hint at connections not only to captives in warfare, but to the very threads of the universe itself, binding human and divine in one unbroken chain. What is certain is that these monuments demanded as much labor as the colossal heads, carved with the same painstaking effort and deliberately positioned within ceremonial complexes. Some face plazas, others align with cardinal directions, as though inscribed into the cosmic map of Olmec cities. And when one considers them alongside the colossal heads, a picture begins to form. A society where rulers projected their power in stone, declaring both earthly dominance and cosmic legitimacy. Still, the thrones whisper more than they speak. Were they platforms for ceremony or gateways to another reality? The question hangs in the air unanswered. A reminder that the Olmecs encoded their truths in symbols meant to endure, but never to fully reveal. Among the most haunting symbols of the Olmec world is the image scholars call the Wurjagoa. It appears again and again in their art, on jade figurines, carved altars, and polished celts. Always the features are the same almond-shaped eyes with a downturned curve, a cleft on the forehead, and a wide, snarling mouth with feline fangs. Sometimes the figure is depicted as an infant, limp in the arms of a human. Other times it takes the form of a powerful adult hybrid, half man, half jaguar. To the Olmecs, the jaguar was not just another animal, it was the apex predator of their dense rainforests, moving unseen through the undergrowth, feared for its strength and its uncanny ability to kill silently. The Olmecs seemed to believe the jaguar was more than a beast. It was a spirit, a force of nature that could merge with human form. But what did the word jaguar truly mean? Some researchers suggest it represents shamanic transformation. In this view, Olmec shamans, through ritual and trance, believed they could cross into the spiritual world by taking on the essence of the jaguar. To wear its features in art was to proclaim mastery of that transformation, a sign of spiritual power. Others propose it symbolizes fertility and rain, noting that the cleft head resembles sprouting maize or even a flowing stream. The limp, infant-like body in some depictions may suggest sacrifice, renewal, or the offering of divine children to ensure the cycle of life. Yet others argue it may have been a dynastic emblem, a sacred bloodline traced to mythic unions between humans and jaguars, binding rulers to supernatural ancestry. Whatever its origin, The word jaguar became one of the defining motifs of Olmec culture, spreading far beyond their heartland. Later, Mesoamerican civilizations, from the Maya to the Aztec, inherited jaguar deities and warrior cults that echo the Olmec fascination. Even today, the image unsettles, as if meant to. The downturned eyes and gaping mouth create a sense of sorrow as much as menace. A being caught between worlds, never fully at peace. Perhaps that is the secret of its power, not as a single symbol to be solved, but as a paradox at once child and beast, human and divine, predator and victim. And so, like the Olmecs themselves, the word jaguar refuses to explain itself. Instead, it lingers in stone and jade, a puzzle carved for future generations to ponder. Could it be the key to unlocking Olmec cosmology, a mask designed to forever obscure it? If basalt was the medium of Olmec power, jade was the medium of Olmec spirit. To the Olmecs, jade was no ordinary stone, found only in select river valleys of Mesoamerica. Its rich, green shimmer carried connotations of fertility, vegetation, water, and eternal life. In a world where crops meant survival and the cycle of rain and maize dictated prosperity, jade became the very essence of vitality. Small though many of the jade objects are, their craftsmanship rivals the effort put into colossal heads. Beads, earspools, axes, figurines, piece was polished with meticulous care, often drilled or carved with remarkable precision, using tools no more advanced than stone and sand. The Olmecs seemed to view jade not only as beautiful but as sacred, a material imbued with divine energy. Many jade objects were never meant for display or use, but for burial. Graves of high-ranking individuals often contained caches of jade offerings, as though the stone would guide or protect the spirit on its journey to the afterlife. Figurines of human figures, sometimes wearing masks or bearing Wurjagira features, were buried in elaborate deposits, perhaps to serve as companions or guardians in the next world. Even jade axes, polished to brilliance but clearly never used, were ritually killed and interred, their green surfaces gleaming in the dark earth. Yet jade was not only about death, it was also about legitimacy and power in life. Rulers adorned themselves with jade ornaments, placing the shimmering green against their skin, a visible sign of wealth and divine connection. To wear jade was to proclaim one's authority not just as a political leader, but as a mediator between the human and the sacred. The difficulty of acquiring jade made it even more precious. Quarries were distant, trade networks long, and only those with influence could command the labor and exchange needed to obtain it. Thus, jade was both a currency of power and a bridge to the supernatural, reserved for those who stood at the apex of Olmec society. And still, the Olmecs never left us a text to explain exactly why jade mattered so deeply. Was it the color, mirroring the life of maize stalks rising from the soil? Was it the shimmering translucence, suggesting a world just beyond the visible? Or was it, like so much else in their culture, a symbol layered with meanings too vast to untangle? What we know is this: in the heart of Olmec ritual, greenstone carried a promise that life and death were two faces of the same eternal cycle, alongside jade figurines and polished axes. Archaeologists have unearthed a striking collection of masked objects that deepen the mystery of Olmec ritual life. These masks, often carved from jadeite, serpentine, or other hard greenstones, are not oversized theatrical masks meant for wearing, but small, precise, and hauntingly lifelike. Their features are unmistakable: almond-shaped eyes, downturned mouths, flattened noses, and subtle clefts that echo the Wurjagua motif. To look upon them is to see faces both human and otherworldly, as if they were portraits not of individuals, but of archetype spirits, ancestors, or deities who straddled the threshold between the mortal and divine. What role did these masks play? Some scholars argue they were funerary objects, placed with the dead to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. The carved face standing in as a substitute or eternal double of the deceased. Others suggest they were used in rituals, held up to the face of a ruler or shaman to transform the wearer into a divine being, if only for the duration of the ceremony. The polished surfaces, smooth as glass, suggest hours of labor for objects that may have been seen only briefly in torchlight or moonlight, their gleam flickering in sacred darkness. Intriguingly, many Olmec-style masks have been found not in Olmec sites, but in later contexts such as Aztec offerings in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs, it seems, revered these ancient relics, treating them as sacred heirlooms of a forgotten age, perhaps not fully understanding their origin but sensing their power. This continuity across centuries hints at the enduring aura of Olmec artistry, the way their objects carried meaning long after the civilization itself had faded into silence. Some masks feature drilled holes along the edges, as though they were once affixed to something else, costumes, wooden effigies, or ritual bundles suggesting that they may have been only one component of a larger ceremonial ensemble. Others appear deliberately broken or ritually killed before being buried, as though their purpose had been fulfilled. And always the same feeling returns. These masks were never just art. They were tools, conduits, vessels through which humans could commune with forces larger than themselves. Their faces seemed to look back at us, questioning rather than explaining, daring us to decide whether they depict gods, rulers, ancestors, or something stranger still. One is left to wonder, did the Olmecs intend these masks to reveal the face of the divine, or to conceal it forever behind a veil of green stone? Few images of the ancient world are as instantly recognizable as the Olmec colossal heads, towering up to 11 feet tall and weighing as much as 40 tons. These monumental sculptures dominate the landscape where they are found, their sheer scale forcing the viewer to reckon with the power and resources of the civilization that carved them. Each head is unique, bearing distinctive facial features, broad noses, full lips, and individualized expressions that hint at personality. Scholars often interpret them as portraits of rulers, immortalized in stone to project authority even beyond death. The headdresses carved into the stone suggest helmets, possibly linked to ritual ball games or symbols of martial power, yet no one knows precisely who they represent. Were they kings, warriors, gods, or perhaps all three? What deepens the enigma is the labor involved. The basalt used for these sculptures was quarried from the distant Tuxtla Mountains, in some cases transported over 50 miles across rivers and swamps, without wheels, beasts of burden, or metal tools. The Olmecs still managed to shape, polish, and move these enormous stones with uncanny precision. Imagine teams of workers dragging the colossal blocks on wooden sledges, navigating treacherous terrain, guided perhaps by chants, drums, and rituals designed to imbue the stones with sacred energy as they traveled. And yet, despite their size, these heads are not scattered randomly. They are deliberately positioned within ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and Venta, sometimes facing outward as though standing guard, other times arranged in groupings that suggest cosmic or political meaning. One particularly haunting detail Many of the colossal heads are recarved from earlier monuments, their original forms lost beneath the new visages. This act of reshaping may have symbolized renewal, or perhaps an attempt to erase older leaders, replacing their memory with the image of a new ruler. Even today, standing before one of these heads is a profound experience, the massive eyes staring into an unknowable distance, lips pressed into silence, the weight of time heavy in their stony features. They seem alive and yet timeless, frozen in an eternal vigil. And so the question lingers, were these colossal heads meant as guardians, protecting the living from unseen forces, or were they meant as warnings, reminding all who entered Olmec territory of the unshakable power of those who ruled? If San Lorenzo was the first great center of Olmec power, Venta became its spiritual heart. Rising on an island in the midst of swampy lowlands, this ceremonial city was carefully designed, its layout aligned with cosmic principles that mirrored the heavens above and the sacred landscape below. At its core stood a massive clay pyramid, one of the earliest in Mesoamerica, reaching 100 feet high, an artificial mountain rising from the flat plains, a place where the Olmecs could bridge the world of men and the world of gods. Surrounding it were plazas, platforms, and mounds arranged with startling precision, suggesting a people deeply concerned with order, symbolism, and the choreography of ritual. Within Venta, archaeologists uncovered extraordinary offerings, mosaic pavements of serpentine blocks laid in intricate patterns, only to be deliberately buried once completed, never meant to be seen again by human eyes. There were caches of jade celts arranged in fan-like shapes, infant figurines placed in circles, and altars carved with images of rulers emerging from jaguar maws. These offerings speak to a worldview in which ritual acts were more powerful when hidden. Sacrifices made not for human spectators but for the unseen forces that governed fertility, rain, and cosmic balance. Venta also revealed the Olmec's mastery of symbolism. Monuments depicting rulers holding rope-like bands that bound captives, suggesting both political power and sacred duty. The site was not simply a place of residence, but a stage where myths were enacted, where kings became gods, and where the community gathered to reaffirm their place in the cosmic order. The sheer effort required to build Venta in such an inhospitable environment underscores its sacred importance. Tons of earth were hauled in to shape the pyramid and platforms, while exotic stones were imported from faraway regions, embedding the city with the essence of distant lands. Yet by 400 BC, Venta too fell silent, its monuments buried or defaced, its pyramid eroded by time. What caused its abandonment remains a mystery: climate change, shifting rivers, or the collapse of political order. But the memory of Venta did not vanish. Later civilizations would echo its designs, replicating pyramids, plazas, and processional ways, as if the Olmecs had passed on a blueprint for sacred cities. And so we are left to wonder, was Venta a capital for men? Or was it a capital for gods, a place where human power and divine presence fused into one? Among the most haunting and enigmatic legacies of the Olmecs are their colossal heads. Massive stone sculptures that still command awe thousands of years after their creation. Each head hewn from a single basalt boulder, transported from distant quarries, sometimes hundreds of miles away, is a monumental achievement, both in scale and ambition. Some stand over 9 feet tall, weighing multiple tons, their sheer presence imposing even in the quiet of an empty museum hall. The faces themselves are striking. Broad noses, full lips, and helmet-like headgear, expressions frozen in a moment that feels almost alive, as if the stone had absorbed the essence of the rulers it represents. Scholars have long debated the purpose of these heads. Were they portraits of powerful kings, intended to immortalize their authority and remind villagers of the reach of their leader? Or did they serve a more mystical role, perhaps acting as guardians to sacred spaces, channels for divine energy, or even as ancestral spirits watching over the living? Transporting these boulders alone would have required immense coordination, ingenious engineering, and the labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of workers. Logs, ropes, and sheer human determination would have carried these stones across rivers, swamps, and rugged terrain, testament to both Olmec ingenuity and their devotion to monumental art. And yet, the heads were not isolated. Many were part of larger ceremonial complexes, placed near pyramids, plazas, or mounds, positioned in ways that suggest ritual significance, processions, or alignment with celestial events. Each head is unique, showing subtle differences in facial features and headgear, hinting at individual identity, rank, or lineage. Yet despite their realism, there is an aura of mystery. The eyes often seem watchful, the expressions ambiguous, almost unreadable, smiling, stern, or contemplative depending on the angle of sunlight or the imagination of the observer. Modern science has traced the basalt quarries to the Tuxtla Mountains, revealing the Olmecs' impressive logistical skills. But the question remains, why devote such effort to these silent sentinels? Some researchers believe they were political propaganda. Others suggest they were spiritual conduits, and yet no definitive answer exists. What is clear is that the colossal heads are more than mere art. They are a window into a civilization that valued power, identity, and perhaps a connection to forces beyond human comprehension. Standing before one today, it is impossible not to feel the presence of a culture that, though long vanished, continues to gaze back at us from the depths of time, silently challenging us to understand its secrets. The spiritual life of the Olmecs remains shrouded in mystery, glimpsed only through fragments of artifacts, stelae, and monumental sculptures that hint at a world alive with ritual and symbolism. Among their most pervasive motifs is the jaguar, a creature both feared and revered, appearing in figurines, masks, and carvings. The word jaguar, an enigmatic fusion of human and jaguar features throughout Olmec art. Its wide, staring eyes and downturned mouth evoking a presence that is at once alluring and terrifying. Scholars debate its meaning. Some suggest it represents shamans entering altered states, a spiritual bridge between the human and animal realms. Others propose it symbolizes power, fertility, or ancestral spirits. Temples, modest by later standards, yet monumental in their own way, likely hosted ceremonies meant to appease gods, honor rulers, or ensure bountiful harvests. These ceremonial centers, particularly San Lorenzo and Venta, were built atop raised platforms where pyramids, plazas, and mounds formed an ordered sacred landscape. The Olmecs' use of water and earth within their religious spaces hints at a sophisticated understanding of ritual symbolism. Artificial ponds, drainage channels, and raised platforms may have mirrored cosmic or natural cycles, reinforcing the connection between human activity and divine forces. Offerings of jade, obsidian, and finely crafted ceramics have been found buried beneath mounds, sometimes accompanied by human remains, suggesting sacrificial rites, though the scale and purpose of such sacrifices remain speculative. The the presence of figurines depicting pregnant women, infants, and mythical creatures hints at a belief system intertwined with life, death, and regeneration, where fertility, growth, and survival were sacred concerns. Even the placement of colossal heads may have held religious significance, aligned with cardinal points, positioned near ceremonial mounds, or oriented to track the movement of the sun. These massive sculptures may have been silent observers of celestial events, marking time and ritual. Intriguingly, caves and rock shelters decorated with Olmec-style paintings, such as those in Juxtaloic, indicate that sacred spaces were not limited to open plazas, but extended into hidden, intimate locales where light and shadow could heighten the sense of mystery and transcendence. Yet, despite these clues, the precise nature of Olmec religion remains elusive. We see symbols, we find offerings, and we infer intent. But the true voice of the Olmec priesthood, the incantations spoken, the songs sung, remain forever lost to time. And so, the jaguar stares back across millennia, a reminder of a culture where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were blurred, and where mystery itself was sacred. What other secrets did the Olmecs conceal beneath the earth, in the shadows of their pyramids and the silence of their stone guardians? The Olmecs were masters not only of culture but of material, transforming the raw gifts of their world into objects of enduring beauty and mystery. Perhaps no material was more revered than jade, its deep green translucent shimmering with a life of its own. The Kun's axe, for instance, stands as a monumental testament to their craftsmanship, a jade object over a foot tall, carved with precision, polished to an almost liquid smoothness, yet unlikely ever to have functioned as a tool. Some researchers argue such objects were ceremonial, vessels of spiritual or political authority, while others see them as symbols of wealth, an Olmec currency of prestige and power. Beyond jade, the Olmec-shaped basalt, obsidian, and serpentine, fashioning colossal heads that could weigh tens of tons, carved with the faces of rulers whose identities and deeds are now lost to history. The sheer scale of these heads is staggering. Imagine transporting these stones from distant quarries, rolling, dragging, and lifting them with ingenuity that hints at sophisticated engineering knowledge. Smaller carvings, too, hold subtle power figurines of infants, twins, and supernatural beings rendered with careful attention to proportion and expression, suggesting not only aesthetic sensibility but also deep symbolic meaning. These objects often depict hybrid creatures, merging human, animal, and divine elements, hinting at a worldview where the boundaries between beings were fluid, and where art itself was a language bridging worlds. Polished celts, incised vessels, and masks suggest that Olmec artisans had developed techniques of remarkable precision, using stone, bone, and shell with equal finesse. The repetition of certain motifs, jaguars, serpents, corn, and supernatural beings throughout Olmec artifacts points to a shared iconography, a visual language that communicated status, belief, and lineage. Yet, as impressive as these creations are, they pose as many questions as they answer. Were these objects intended for the living, to mark ceremonies and power, or for the dead, to accompany spirits into the afterlife? Were the colossal heads portraits, symbols, or both? And what stories or myths were whispered as these stones were shaped, polished, and placed? Each artifact, each careful cut and curve, whispers of a civilization that viewed the material world as inseparable from the spiritual, where stone could embody authority, protection, and memory in their artistry. The Olmecs left behind a silent yet eloquent testament not only to their skill, but to the mysteries of a society whose voice we may never fully hear. And as we move from the realm of stone into the fertile fields and villages that fed this civilization, the question lingers: how did the Olmecs live, eat, and sustain a culture so monumental, yet so fragile in memory? Beyond the grandeur of stone and jade, the Olmecs lived among the earth, in villages scattered across the fertile lands of Veracruz and Tabasco. These were not the sprawling ceremonial centers of San Lorenzo or Venta, but quieter settlements, modest clusters of houses perched on higher ground, safe from the frequent flooding of rivers. Imagine stepping into one of these villages, the sun-warming thatched roofs, the air thick with the scent of fresh earth and herbs, the soft murmur of children playing near storage pits used for maize, beans, and tubers. Each household consisted of a simple dwelling, a lean-to for tools and daily chores, and one or more pits primitive yet ingenious root cellars that preserved the fruits of the earth. Gardens sprouted near homes, small havens of medicinal and cooking herbs, alongside domesticated sunflowers, and perhaps a distant avocado or cacao tree, heavy with fruit, swaying in a gentle breeze. The Olmecs were skilled cultivators. Riverside plots fed crops between floods, while slash-and-burn agriculture cleared the dense forests for maize, beans, squash, cassava, and sweet potato, ensuring the soil remained fertile. Villagers moved from field to field, tending their crops, while others fished in the nearby rivers, collecting turtle, mollusks, and fish, or hunted birds, peccaries, deer, and raccoon. Coastal communities added crabs and shellfish to their diet, highlighting the adaptability and diversity of Olmec sustenance. Archaeological studies reveal a curious detail. Despite this variety, the domesticated dog was perhaps the most common source of animal protein, a reminder of how human-animal relationships shaped daily life. Meals were simple yet nourishing, the labor of fields and rivers woven into each bite. Life was cyclical, attuned to seasons, floods, and harvests, but it was also embedded with ritual, as modest temples hinted at the spiritual rhythms guiding even ordinary tasks. The Olmec's daily existence, hard-working, intimate, and communal, stands in stark contrast to the monumental stone structures that dominate our imagination. It is here, among the hum of village life, that the foundations of civilization were nurtured, the blending of agriculture, ritual, and social cohesion that would influence generations beyond them. And yet, as we ponder these villages and fields, we must ask, how did such humble lives support a culture capable of moving mountains of stone and carving stories into jade, leaving a legacy that continues to haunt archaeologists and historians alike? The Olmecs were not only cultivators of the land but also masterful artisans, shaping the intangible into the tangible, capturing belief and power in stone, jade, and clay. Picture the colossal heads of San Lorenzo and Venta, each weighing several tons, with features so vivid they seem almost alive: broad noses, thick lips, and eyes that stare into the distance, perhaps gazing into realms we cannot reach. Some researchers believe these heads represent rulers or divine intermediaries, while others suggest they may be ancestral portraits imbued with ritual significance. Beyond the massive sculptures, smaller, intricate carvings reveal a culture fascinated with the intersection of human and animal forms. The word jaguar motif, with its slitted eyes and downturned mouth, recurs throughout Olmec art, appearing in statuettes, masks, and ceremonial objects. Scholars speculate this figure may have represented shamanic transformation, spiritual guardians, or fertility symbols, yet its precise meaning remains elusive. Jade, prized above all materials, was carved into axes, masks, and figurines. The Kun's axe, for example, though shaped like a weapon, was likely ritualistic, a silent testament to a culture where art and spirituality intertwined. Olmec iconography frequently features serpents, birds, and aquatic creatures, motifs that later appear in Maya and Aztec symbolism, hinting at an artistic legacy that reverberated through Mesoamerica. Even ceramics, once thought primitive, reveal a sophisticated aesthetic. Figurines of pregnant women, elaborately painted bottles, and travertine vessels with incised patterns suggest attention to detail, narrative, and ceremony. The Olmecs did not merely create objects. They encoded meaning, belief, and power into every curve and line, leaving a silent dialogue across millennia. Yet, as we marvel at these creations, questions persist. Who were the hands that carved them? What rituals were performed before these eyes were set into stone or jade? And how much of their symbolic language remains lost, slipping through the cracks of history, leaving only hints and shadows? The mystery of Olmec art endures, not just in the objects themselves, but in the haunting absence of complete understanding, an echo of a civilization that spoke in forms, not words, and whose voice we can only partially hear. From these silent stones, we sense a culture simultaneously intimate and monumental, enigmatic yet profoundly human. And as we turn from the art to the people themselves, the question lingers: how did such an advanced culture vanish into obscurity, leaving only traces of its ingenuity behind? As we arrive at the final chapter of the Olmec story, we are left with a question that has haunted archaeologists, historians, and enthusiasts alike. How does a civilization so sophisticated, so influential, vanish almost without a trace, leaving behind only whispers in stone, jade, and earth? The Olmecs, with their monumental heads, intricate carvings, and complex societal structures, laid the foundations for much of what would come to define Mesoamerican civilization. Iconography, agricultural techniques, and perhaps even political organization. Yet, paradoxically, their cities faded, their names were forgotten, and their achievements became obscured in the annals of history. Some researchers suggest environmental changes, river shifts, and flooding may have prompted migrations, scattering communities and fragmenting societal cohesion. Others propose internal social upheaval or the slow decline of centralized authority as possible causes, leaving villages to adapt independently while monumental centers fell silent. Despite this apparent disappearance, the Olmec's influence is woven into the fabric of later civilizations. The jaguar motifs, serpent imagery, and colossal stone heads echo in the art of the Maya, Zapotecs, and Aztecs. Agricultural innovations, including maize cultivation and possibly early irrigation methods, spread across Mesoamerica, carried perhaps by Olmec knowledge or parallel development. Even their ritualistic and ceremonial concepts, shamanic transformations, ancestral veneration, and spiritual symbolism seem to resonate in the practices of civilizations that followed. Mitochondrial DNA studies confirm the Olmecs were deeply rooted in the Americas, sharing genetic lineages with later populations, reinforcing their identity as an indigenous cornerstone of Mesoamerican history. And yet, they remain elusive, a civilization known more through what survives than what is written. There are no Olmec records in stone or codices that recount their daily lives, their rulers, or their philosophies in their own words. What we know comes from fragments, artifacts, burial sites, monumental heads, and the faint traces of villages scattered across the land. These remnants offer tantalizing glimpses, but never the complete picture. As we consider the Olmecs today, we confront both admiration and melancholy. Admiration for their ingenuity, artistry, and cultural sophistication, and melancholy for a civilization that once flourished, whose voice has been almost entirely silenced by time. In the end, the Olmecs remind us that history is not always linear, that greatness can rise and fall, and that even in disappearance, the echoes of a people can ripple across centuries, shaping the world in ways we may never fully comprehend. Their mystery endures, inviting us to peer deeper into the shadows, to question, to wonder, and to remember a mother civilization that quietly shaped the Americas.